Okay, for this video we're going to divide fractions in a different way using an area model. So we're going to start out with 1/2 divided by 1/3. Okay, so you're going to start out just like you did before. So we're going to have our rectangle and we're going to divide it in half. And then we want just half of that. So it's not going to be exact here, but I just want half of that rectangle. Okay, so there's my half of my rectangle. Now I want to divide it by 1/3. So that means I want to know how many 1/3 are in a half. So we're not dividing by 3. We are dividing by 1/3. So how many 1/3 are in a half? So what we're going to end up doing is it's similar to what you would do with the other one. We're going to break it into 3 pieces, but you're going to break the whole thing into 3 pieces. And now we have how many pieces, because we're seeing how many times 1/3 goes into half. So we have 3 pieces, and we want to see how many halves is that? How many thirds does that make up? So this whole thing is a third, okay? So I have half of a third, another half of a third, and another half of a third. So I have 1.5 thirds. So your answer is 1.5. So we were trying to see how many thirds were there. So this was how much of the rectangle I got to fill in. And now we're seeing, well, how many thirds does that add up to? So I break it into 3 pieces to see how many thirds these little rectangles now will fill up. So it'll fill up just a half of a third. And if you put this piece over here, that's a full third, and then another half of a third. So it is 1.5. And now to prove that, we can prove it. So remember that if you have like 20 divided by 4 equal to 5, that means that 5 times 4 is equal to 20. So it goes backwards. So we can check this by making sure that 1.5 thirds is actually 1/2. So you know how to multiply fractions. Let's change this first one into a mixed number, or an improper fraction. So that would be 3/2 times 1/3. We can reduce here before, you don't have to, but it's easier to reduce here because it's just going to be 3 divided by 3 once you multiply it together. So you're going to reduce those both to 1, and then you have 1 times 1 in the numerator, which is 1, and in the denominator 2 times 1, which is 2. And that is 1/2. And I should have put that, well, I have 1/2, and I figure out that's 1/2 equals 1/2. So it is true. So I just proved that my answer is correct. So 1/2 divided by 1/3 is 1.5. Let's do another example. This is another one that I did on the first video. So again, if we only have half of this rectangle, and again, I'm just going to estimate here, so mine will not be exact, but say that's a half, and I'm going to fill it in, my little rectangle again. So fill it in. So I only have half of my rectangle, half of a whole, and I want to divide that into fourths. So I'm going to see how many fourths are in 1/2. That's what your question is. How many times does 1/4 divide into 1/2? So we're going to cut it up the other way into fourths and see how many fourths we fill up. Okay, so now this piece right here is a half of a fourth. So I have 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2 total. So that's going to be 2/4, because if you put this piece over here, that'll be 1/4. And then put this piece here, that would make 2/4. So I have 4 pieces, which are halves, so that makes 2. So 1/2 divided by 1/4 is 2. There are 2 fourths in a half. And again, we can test this by making sure that 2 times 1/4 is equal to 1/2. So that's just 2 over 1 times 1 over 4. Is that equal to 1/2? Again, we can cross reduce. And then 1 times 2 is, or 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2. So 1/2 equals 1/2. So we are correct. Let's move on to a little more difficult example. So this time we're breaking it up into thirds first. So I'm going to need to keep my lines here. 1, 2, okay? And I'm going to fill those in with purple here. Actually, I'm going to darken my lines and make it black. So I cut it into thirds and I get 2 of them, because that's how many I have. I have 2/3, not 1/3, I have 2. So I'm going to color that in, color 2 of them in. Okay, now I'm trying to see how many halves fit into those. Okay, so now I've filled up part of my rectangle, but I want to know how much of a half that fills up. I want to know if it fills up a half at all. So I can see that that's at least half of my rectangle. So I'm going to have at least 1/2 in 2/3, because 2/3 is bigger than 1/2. So to make sure to see how much of the square it fills up, I want to know how many halves it fills up, I'm going to split it into 2 pieces. Okay? So I know that in order to be half of this rectangle, I need 3 of those pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the 3 pieces that I have. So I've got 3 pieces right here. So that constitutes 1/2 of this rectangle, because it's 3 out of the 6 squares. So I know that this is 1 and something. So then the rest of the half of the rectangle is split into 3 pieces. So that's thirds. And how many of them do you get? 1. So there's 1 1/3 halves in 2/3. And again, we can check this by multiplying 1 1/3 by 1/2 and making sure we get 2/3. So 1 1/3 is actually 4/3. Times 1/2, is that equal to 2/3? We're still not sure. We got to check here. So I'm going to reduce again before I go on. So 4 divides by 2, and so does 2. So those you're going to divide 4 by 2 anyway. So that's 2. Reduce there, and that's all that can be done. So 2 times 1 is 2, and then 3 times 1 is 3. So 2/3 equals 2/3. We're correct. So there, remember, you gotta understand what's being asked. I'm asking how many halves are in 2/3. And that is, there are 1 1/3 halves in 2/3. Okay, so back to the first example we did. So the rule when you are dividing fractions is to multiply by the reciprocal. So actually, I'm tripling the number that I have, because we know that it's easier to do if you have a whole. So if you did 1 divided by a third, we're saying how many thirds are in 1? Well, there are 3 of them, because you cut them into 3 pieces. So there's a total of 3 pieces. They each are worth a third. But again, for these ones, I'm not wondering what they're worth. I'm wondering how many of them there are. So there are 3. Answer would be 3. So that's the same thing as doing 1 times 3 over 1, so the reciprocal. So that's 3. So let's see how it works out for this one. So we're going to do 1/2 divided by 1/3. And that's the same thing. We're still going to triple the amount of pieces we have. So we have 1/2 times, times 3 over 1, times the reciprocal. And then you multiply the fractions. 1 times 3 is 3, and 2 times 1 is 2. So your answer is 3/2, which is 1 1/2. So let's see how that looks on your picture. So basically, when I cut that into 3 pieces, I tripled the amount of pieces I have. I now have, from that, I have 1, 2, 3 pieces. And what size are they according to the pieces I cut them in? Well, they're halves. They're halves of thirds. So I have 3 halves. And that's how you get your answer. Let's look at the second one we did. All right, let's do one with a mixed number. So now we have 2.5 divided by 1/3. So I'm saying how many thirds are in 2 and 1/2? And if you look at this as decimals, it might help too. So 2.5 divided by 0.3 repeating. How many times would 0.3 repeating go into 2.5? So we know it's going to be more than 1 because this is so much smaller. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. We get 2.5 squares. So I'm going to fill that in real quick. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing as we did last time. We want to see how many thirds this fills up. So we have our filled in squares. We want to know how many thirds that is. So let's not do that big of a line. It won't let me undo, so we're just going to pretend I didn't do that. Okay. So to see how many thirds it fills up, we want to split it into thirds. And so obviously if you have a whole, you're going to have 3/3 from each of these. So this one has 3 and this one has 3. So we don't care about the size of the pieces in our final answer here. How many is what we want to know. How many thirds there are 3 of them. How many thirds there are 3 of them. In the second one too. And then in this third one, this is just like the one where we did 1/2 divided by 3, because this is the part we're doing now. We're taking the half and dividing it by 3. So how many thirds does that portion fill up? Well, we know that 2 of those pieces would make a third. So 2 of these pieces make 1/3, because if this one was here, it would be a full third. So I know that I have at least one more third from this one. So I get another third. But then I've got a little piece still. So this would make up the other third, and this would make up the third third. So how much of that third do I get? I get half of it, because only half of this is filled in. So I only get a half of a third, so it's actually 1.5. So there are 1.5 thirds in a half. So here I can see that half of a rectangle makes 1.5 thirds. So 1.5 plus the 3/3 from this one plus the 3 from that one. So we have a total of 7.5. So 2.5 divided by 1/3 is 7.5. And again, we can prove this by doing our answer times what we divided by and make sure we get our original number. So let's do that. Let's make sure that 7.5 times 1/3 is actually 2.5. So let's change this to an improper fraction. So that's 15 halves times 1/3. Is that equal to 2.5? And you can draw pictures for these too. Well, let's go ahead and reduce. So this would divide by, both can divide by 3, 5 and 1. And then let's multiply. So 5 times 1 is 5. And then 2 times 1 is 2. So 5 halves. Is that equal to 2.5? Why, yes it is, because 5 halves is 2.5. So you put that back into a mixed number. 2.5 equals 2.5. So we are correct. So the whole point of this video is to explain what we mean when we divide fractions and why we'll do the next step. So I'm going to show you another example and show you, well, I'm going to go back to the other examples and show you the shortcuts now. So for this one we did 1/2 divided by 1/4. So again, dividing fractions is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So if I had 1 divided by 1/4, how many fourths are in 1? Well, there are 4 of them because you cut it into 4 pieces. So the same thing's going to happen here. I cut it into 4 pieces, okay? And so now I have 4 pieces, and they are each worth half of that fourth. So I have 1/2 2, or 1/2 1, 1.5 2. So your answer is 2. And then for this example, 2/3 divided by 1/2. So we've got it a little different because we have that number there, but it's not going to change anything. is going to be the same thing as doing 2/3 times 2 over 1. So times by the reciprocal. Because we're doubling the amount we have. If we had 1 and we divided it by half, I'm saying how many halves are in 1? And there are 2 of them. So I'm actually doubling the amount of pieces. So by cutting it in half, I doubled the amount of pieces. I no longer have 2. I have 4 pieces, but I want to see how many halves that makes up. So it makes up, 3 of them make up 1/2, because we're in thirds here, and then 1 out of 3. So it is going to be 1 1/3, which is 4/3. So you can look at it this way too. Each of these pieces are singular, are a third, because 3 of them are a half, so each piece is a third. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 thirds, which is again 1 1/3. So there are 1 1/3 halves in 2/3. Okay, last one here. I already talked about this just a little bit, so we're multiplying by 3 by the reciprocal, so we're actually tripling the amount of halves we have. So if we are tripling the amount of halves, I have 1, 2, 3 halves, because these are halves of a third. So 3 halves, which would be 1, this constitutes 1/3, and then you have 1/2 of a third. So it is 1 1/2. I want to do one more example here that's a little more involved. So I'm going to do 3/4 divided by 2/3. So this time we've got our rectangle. This is going to be freehand here, so bear with me. 1, 2, 3. So there's 4 pieces, and I only get 3 of them. So I get 1 piece, 2 pieces, and 3 pieces. Now I want to see how many 2/3 are in there. So I'm going to break this up into thirds. So I'm actually tripling the amount. So remember, I'm actually doing 3/4 times 3 halves. So I'm multiplying by 3, so I'm tripling the amount of pieces I have. So 1, 2. And then I'm dividing that by 2. So I'm dividing by 2 because it's in the denominator now. Or I'm trying to see how many 2/3 these rectangles make. So I want to fill in 2/3 of my rectangle. How many times I can fill in 2/3 of a rectangle. So to be 2/3 of this rectangle, because remember, I'm dividing by 2/3. So I want to see these pieces could make even 1 2/3. So to be 2/3, you need to fill in these 2 rows. So I'm going to take, which means you need 8 pieces. Because 1, 2, 3, 4 would be 1/3, 1, 2, 3, 4 would be 2/3. So I need 8 of those pieces, which I have at least 8. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have 8. That is 1 2/3. So you have 1. So 2/3 goes into 3/4 once for sure. And then the next part was we have a fraction. So to be a 2/3, this one gets a little tricky. I need 8 pieces. I only have 1 of those 8 pieces. So I have 1/8 of the pieces that I need. So it's 1 1/8. Which will work out because when I multiply this here, I'll get 9/8, which is 1 1/8. Okay, and we can make sure we prove this by going backwards. So make sure that 1 1/8 or 9/8 times what we divided by, so 2/3, is really equal to 3/4. Now it might be helpful to actually draw this one out. So if we have 9/8, 2 rectangles, and they're split into 8 pieces. So we have 1, 2, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. On this one we only get 1, and this one we get the whole thing because that's 1 1/8. Okay, times 2/3. So we're cutting it into 3 pieces and seeing how many, and only taking 2 of them because I don't want all the thirds. I just want 2 out of every 3. That's what it means to take 2/3. You just want 2 out of every 3. So we're going to cut these into 3 pieces and take 2 of every third. So we get these 2, and then we get these 2, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 sets of 2. So we have 16 pieces there. And what size are they? Well, we had 8 pieces cut into 3. So those are 24ths. So we have 16 24ths here. And down here we have 2 more 24ths. So we have a total of 18 24ths. And when we reduce that, divide each by 2, that is 9 12ths. Oops, you could have divided by 6. So divide by 3 is 3/4. And that is the answer that we should get. We should get 3/4. And again, let's make sure that's right by multiplying. So 9 times 2 is 18. 8 times 3 is 24. And again, that reduces to 3/4. So that kind of shows a little harder example on how division works. So the rule in general is dividing is multiplying by a reciprocal. By a reciprocal. So that's really important. A lot of times we only use this when we're doing fractions, but you can use this in real numbers too. So if I wanted to do 24 divided by 3, that's the same thing as 24 times 1/3. Because what ends up happening is when you multiply these fractions now, 24 times 1 is 24. And then since your 3 ends up in the denominator, that means you're dividing by it. So 1 times 3 is 3. And so I end up getting 24 divided by 3, which is exactly what I asked you in the first place. And so that answer would be 8, just like you knew it was 8 in the beginning. So a lot of times, because this is so straightforward and we can do long division, we don't do it this way. But then when it comes to fractions, if I told you to do 24 divided by 2/3, or let's say 3/2, 24 divided by 3/2, that's when it becomes a little more difficult. You can change it to 1.5 and try it that way, but that's a little harder with long division. So we know that we can just multiply by the reciprocal, 2/3. And here's another reason why we can do that. 24 divided by 3/2 is the same thing as 24 divided by, and I'm going to change 3/2 to be 3 times 1/2. So 3 times 1/2 is the same thing as 1/2. So I am actually taking 24 divided by both of these. So it's actually 24 divided by 3, then divided by 1/2. Okay, so this is a little involved here. But we know that 24 divided by 3 is 8. Okay, and then divided by 1/2. Well, we've done that before. Dividing by 1/2 is just doubling the amount because I'm saying how many halves are in 8, and that's 16. So that's the same thing as 8 times 2 over 1, which is 16. So really what you did here was you divided by 3, which was the numerator. Here is the numerator. And then times by 2, which was the denominator originally. Okay, so multiply by the reciprocal, and that's the reason why. So your answer for 24 times, or divided by 3/2, is 16. And we can prove that by making sure that 16 times 3/2 is actually equal to 24. So is 1.5 times 16 equal to 24? Well, when you're timesing by 1.5, we'll just do this the easy way. Oops, I somehow undid that when it would never let me do that before. So it was 16 times 3/2. So that's times 1.5. So if you get 16 once, that's 16, and then you need a half of 16, which is 8. Add them together, you get 24. So 16 times 3/2, or 1.5, is 24. So we proved that our answer is correct. So that's why when you're dividing, you're always multiplying by the reciprocal.